My earliest memories are not of warm evenings by the fireplace, festive dinners with the family, or of being tucked into bed with gentle words and embraces. No, my memories are not like that. They are filled with loud sounds, tension, and desperate waiting. They are full of screams and door slams. My name is Elsie, and if someone had told me that one day I would be able to forget these sounds, I would have laughed. They were etched into my consciousness so deeply that even after many years, I can still recall every hoarse shout from my father, every helpless sob from my mother, every moment when they were torn apart, seeing nothing but their hatred for each other. It all seemed to start with small things. My father always found something wrong. The dinner was too salty, and that became a catastrophe. The laundry wasn't folded correctly, and again, war. My mother spent too much at the grocery store, and, of course, that meant the end of the world. I never understood what was going on between them, but I could feel the atmosphere in the house shift. It was filled with something heavy, ominous. My father would usually sit at the table, silent and stern, with a look on his face that could kill. He waited for a reason to start. And he always found one. "You can't do anything," he shouted, his face turning as red as a cherry, his voice so loud it seemed like it could tear the air apart. "You're completely useless, Sarah. Do you even know what you're doing? Why can't you be even a little bit helpful? Why?" And his words, like cold knives, would sink into my mother's soul, invisible to him but desperately painful for her. I, a little girl, would hide in my room, pressing my hands to my ears, trying not to hear. But their voices always found a way, like rain through the windows. I heard her crying in the bathroom, hiding her tears under the sound of water, trying to drown out her painful sobs. This went on year after year, like a repeating cycle. There were days when my father was silent and seemed less cool, but it was like the breath before a storm. The tension in the house always hung there, like dark clouds on the horizon, ready to burst at any moment. And it wasn't something I ever got used to. On the contrary, I was always expecting everything to collapse at any second. My father was a successful corporate lawyer. He always said he was the one feeding the family, that everything depended on him. He was proud of this. Every time we faced difficulties, he would remind my mother that he was the one providing for us. This was his weapon, his way of controlling. And while my mother seemed to desperately try to hold on, she was broken. She gave up her career for me, for our family. She sacrificed everything to take care of me, but he never appreciated her sacrifices. He always said she did nothing, that her life was meaningless. I couldn't understand why she didn't leave. Why she stayed, why she didn't try to be happy. I couldn't understand why she didn't resist, didn't shout back, why she didn't try to break free. But I guess she was just like me, caught between two loud sounds, between his anger and her pain. Every day was the same, like a series of unfortunate events that couldn't be dealt with. There were moments when I thought I could find a way to help, but it always turned out that I was powerless. Sometimes I wanted to scream that this wasn't normal, that it shouldn't be this way, but I couldn't. I was too small to change anything. My mother never told me what to do. She, like me, just endured those moments. By the time I was 8, I already knew there was nothing I could do to stop him, to stop them, to change what was happening. Sometimes I wondered if my father had always been like this or if he had changed over time. But perhaps he had never been any different. He was simply someone who didn't know how to love. Someone who could only love himself, and use and suppress everyone else. And I still stayed in the shadows, hiding my tears, my worries, hoping that one day I would see something else. Hoping that this cycle would someday break, that the day would come when I could escape this eternal nightmare. But I knew it was just a dream. The moment I hid in my room, I already understood that my childhood memories wouldn't be filled with fairy tales and magic. They would be filled with fear and helplessness. One evening in October, when the air in the house had already taken on the hint of winter and the leaves outside had begun to lose their bright hues, something happened that seemed almost like a miracle. It was about 6 months after Maria had started working for us. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. My father came home late, tired, with his usual stern expression, but today there was something different about him. He didn't rush to settle at the table with cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey, as he usually did. He went straight to the kitchen, where Maria was already standing by the stove, ladling soup into bowls. They were speaking softly, and I noticed that there was an unusual silence between them, a silence that hadn't existed in our home since my mother had still been with us. "Elsie," my father suddenly said, opening the door to his study, "come here, I need to talk to you." I cautiously stepped into the study, barely hiding my anxiety. I never knew what would happen when my father called me into his office. There was always something unmistakably scary about his office: books, old papers, sketches of people I'd never seen, and the sharp smell of tobacco. In that world that was only his, I often felt like an outsider. But today, everything was different. When I walked in, Maria was standing next to my father's desk, her face lit up by that same smile I now saw every day. Her smile was wide, confident, and, as I thought at the time, touched with a hint of relief. I couldn't understand why, but I felt that behind her smile was something important. "Elsie," my father said, but his voice wasn't as stern as usual. It was soft, almost warm. And, to my surprise, I felt something inside me loosen. "Maria and I are going to get married." I stood frozen, my eyes darting between them, Maria, with her bright, almost childlike smile, and my father, who looked truly happy. Since my mother had left, I hadn't seen that expression on his face. He had always been grim, irritable, tired, and perhaps broken. But today, he was different. I don't know why, but in that moment, I felt a sense of relief. I looked at Maria, and her eyes met mine, and suddenly I felt her kindness envelop me, like a light breeze on a summer's day. She wasn't like my father. She didn't shout, she didn't get irritated, she didn't hurt me. She was different. Maria became my shield in this house, not trying to replace my mother, but simply being there. I remember how she would sit with me when I had nightmares, how she told me stories until I fell asleep. She helped me with my homework, supported me when I felt completely alone in this world. And despite the strange silence in the house, with her, I felt there was room for something good. Maybe this was a chance to become a real family again, the way I remembered it at the beginning, before everything fell apart. "This is great," I said, not knowing what else to add. I meant it. I felt that the future could be different if they were together. Not perfect, of course, but maybe easier. Maybe this would be what I had been missing. Maria leaned down and hugged me. Her perfume smelled of vanilla and light flowers, and I remember that scent to this day. It was warm and gentle, and I felt that embrace become an island of peace in this restless world. I wanted to believe that everything would be all right, that finally there would be room for happiness in our home. Real happiness. "We'll be so happy together," she said, and her words didn't sound like a promise, but more like quiet assurance. In her voice, I felt something soft and beautiful, something that might form the foundation for a new life. My new life. The new life of our family. At first, everything seemed quite normal, almost natural. Maria was kind, attentive, with her soft voice and gentle hands that held me when I was scared or sad. She was the one who sat next to me when I had nightmares, who cooked my favorite dishes, who told stories before bed. But gradually, day by day, her kindness began to take on strange shapes. It was like an old, worn-out handkerchief that at first felt nice in your hands, but then began to irritate the skin, losing its warmth and turning into a nuisance. At first, she forbade my favorite pop music because, according to her, it was too vulgar and inappropriate for a girl my age. Of course, I couldn't understand what was so terrible about songs about love and adventure. I even tried to prove to her that this music helped me develop my imagination and gave me strength to fight against the chaos in our home, but she simply pointed to the bad language in the songs and covered her ears. Then Maria took away the little TV from my room, the one where I used to watch my favorite shows and entertainment programs. "This distracts you from your studies," she said firmly. "You need to focus. Otherwise, how will you become someone, Elsie?" But honestly, my grades were always excellent. I never understood why she had to interfere so much in my life. I was a teenager, but I never neglected my studies. On the contrary, I tried to do everything perfectly. Yet Maria always found some reason to control. She started checking what I wore, not just advising but dictating what was supposed to be comfortable and beautiful. My old jeans, which I wore because they were so comfortable and simple, were thrown out in an instant because they were too casual. For her, for Maria, clothes had to be modest and elegant, according to her taste, of course. Then she made things worse, replacing my bright, colorful blanket with simple white sheets. My room had to, as she said, match the house's aesthetic. Everything I loved gradually disappeared, as if I was losing myself, and with it, my freedom. I couldn't help but notice how, under her influence, my small joys were disappearing one by one. My life was becoming more and more dull, joyless. She even set strict rules for the simplest things, like when I could take a shower. No more than 10 minutes, strictly according to a schedule, at certain hours. Everything had to be under her control. The only light in this darkness was Grandma Helen, my mother's mom, who came to visit me every week. She always brought something special, books I liked, a dress I had dreamed of, or small trinkets that seemed so important to me because they carried the mark of family. Maria couldn't stand it. She didn't like it when I got something from Grandma, because these things were family gifts that she couldn't justify. "You can't just get gifts from your grandmother, Elsie," she said with an arrogant tone, trying her best to hide her irritation. "These things aren't valuable." Grandma always tried to greet me in a special way, hugging me and asking how I was doing, and I felt how the warmth of her hands helped me forget, even if just for a short time. "How are you, my girl?" she would ask, her voice so gentle that I could listen to it forever. I felt how her words sank into my heart, a reminder that there was love somewhere, love that didn't ask for anything in return. And Maria? Maria now seemed foreign to me, cold, and alien to this love. She was alien to everything I once thought was important. Gradually, I began to feel her presence more and more as a burden, like something that bound my movements and thoughts. Everything she did became a form of suppression, a slow destruction of what had once been my world. And I felt that this weight was growing, that with each day I was becoming more and more alien to myself. I loved Sophie, despite everything that was happening in our house. She was still an innocent child, undeserving of all this chaos. But I was 14, and I couldn't let her be at the center of the storm that was consuming our home. I tried to keep my balance, but everything was only getting worse. Every day, I tried to keep my grades up, while also becoming a full-time nanny. From time to time, I caught myself thinking that I was not getting to be a teenager. I had no time for my hobbies, my books, or my music, not even for just being alone. Instead of doing my algebra homework, I was heating up bottles of milk and preparing baby food. I changed diapers and sang lullabies to Sophie because Maria thought I should be the responsible adult, no matter what was happening around us. Instead of working on my history project, I sat with my little sister, wrapping her in a blanket as she fell asleep in my arms. Maria would arrive around 6:30, just before my dad came home. She was always like clockwork, no delays, no unexpected lateness. It was her credo, strictness and discipline, precision and control. Before she arrived, would try to tidy up the kitchen a little, prepare food for Sophie, and a few other things. When she came, she always brought takeaway containers from expensive restaurants. The food she ate was important to her, not only in a physical sense but symbolically. It was her way of asserting power. Look, I'm providing you with the best piece of life. You should be grateful. I was exhausted, cooking and taking care of Sophie, desperately hoping someone would notice that I wasn't just playing the role of an older sister, but becoming something like a mother. But no one noticed. Even my dad, when he came home, didn't see how worn out I was, standing at the stove preparing dishes he didn't even need because he was too preoccupied with himself, his success, and his endless tasks. When my dad entered the house, he always brought the same bag of restaurant containers. It was his way of showing love, giving me something material that symbolized his attention. But he didn't see that I could no longer bear this weight, that I was losing myself trying to hold everything on my shoulders. I stayed in my school uniform, tired and worn out, with Sophie on my hip. My history homework remained untouched, and I couldn't even focus on it. I felt as though this whirlwind of obligations and hopelessness was slowly consuming me. I wanted to scream, I wanted to say, I can't do this anymore. I need time for myself. But something inside me held that scream back. I couldn't allow myself to be weak. One day at school, during lunch break, I couldn't take it anymore. I was sitting at the table with my friend Amanda when my eyes filled with tears. I felt them roll down my cheeks in hot drops, and I couldn't stop them. All the tension, exhaustion, and helplessness poured out. "You have no idea what I'm going through," I said, wiping my tears with my hand. "I have to take care of Sophie every day. I don't even have time to do my homework. It feels like my life is disappearing, and I'm losing myself in it. They don't let me be a teenager. They don't let me be myself." Amanda had a hard time understanding what I was going through, because she hadn't faced anything like this, but she silently listened, nodding her head. I told her how Maria made me look after Sophie, how each day became a series of duties I couldn't escape from. I couldn't even remember the last time I just sat down, read a book, or listened to music, like I used to. "It's not fair," she said. "You shouldn't have to carry this responsibility. You're too young for all of this." I nodded, but I knew nothing would change. I couldn't ask for help, I couldn't complain. All I could do was be strong, survive, and hope that one day it would all end. But inside, a quiet, painful thought began to form. What if this never ends? A week after the CPS incident, I couldn't take it anymore. Everything inside me screamed for help, but I didn't know who to turn to. Dad and Maria seemed invincible to me, like monsters that consumed all the light and left me in the dark. I lay in my room for a long time, listening to the silence that filled the house after they had fallen asleep. I waited until their breathing became steady and calm, and only when I thought the night had swallowed them up did I get out of bed. The phone they had forgotten to take was lying on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, unable to control the trembling in my hands. My mind was clouded, but one thought, one idea pierced me like lightning. I had to call Grandma Helen. When I dialed her number, my voice cracked in my throat, and I, barely holding back tears, whispered into the receiver, "Grandmama, I need help." My words came out like some incoherent, hoarse groan. I told her everything that was happening at our house. About how I had become Sophie's nanny, how Dad and Maria treated me, how I could no longer stand the abuse, how my father's anger seemed more and more unbearable. I spoke of everything I was going through, how there was no freedom, no happiness, only endless control and humiliation. Grandma stayed silent on the other end of the line, only occasionally making quiet sounds of sorrow, as though her heart was breaking with pain for me. But her silence was full of understanding and support, and when I finished, she said decisively, "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Pack your things, dear, just in case." The next morning, I sat in my room again, as always, in my school uniform, as if nothing had happened. But inside, a storm raged. I felt that in my veins flowed not just blood, but some new strength. I knew Grandma Helen was coming, and that was all I needed at that moment, the hope that someone, at last, would help me escape this trap. Grandma arrived right at 9 a.m. When she entered the house, I felt her presence fill the space. She was like a storm, quiet but powerful, like an angel who had entered my world, ready to do whatever it took to change it. She wasn't the way others described her, not the frail old lady that Dad and Maria probably thought she was. Grandma Helen was a strong woman, and she didn't let anyone treat her like a vulnerable victim. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was slightly disheveled, but her eyes were sharp, like the point of a knife, filled with determination and clarity. She entered the house without wasting any time and headed straight to the living room, where Dad and Maria were. I stood in the doorway, watching this moment unfold. I already knew how she would act. She was the diplomat of our family, someone who knew how to find words that could break down even the strongest walls. "I know everything," Grandma Helen said, standing in the center of the living room like an invincible figure. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't causing a scene, but her words sounded like a sentence. "I know how you've turned my granddaughter into an unpaid nanny, how you've tried to squeeze every bit of her. But you've forgotten one important thing. Elsie doesn't belong to you. She is not your property, and I won't let you destroy her soul." She wasn't expecting any objections. It was obvious. Grandma wasn't the type of woman who looked for excuses or agreements. She declared it clearly and firmly, as if it were law. I stood aside, watching her face, her eyes filled with fire, and in that moment, everything around me seemed different. I felt as though my life might finally take a turn for the better. Dad sat across from her, a stunned expression on his face. He couldn't understand how this had happened. He was used to everything in this house following his rules, his will. But Grandma Helen was not like that. Her confidence, her presence were so strong that Dad couldn't even speak. He just sat there, unsure of how to react. Maria stood nearby, just as bewildered, but her face was cold, like stone. I knew she hadn't expected this turn of events, but her gaze at Grandma was full of contempt. She could have said something sharp, tried to defend herself, but she remained silent, and her silence felt even heavier. And at that moment, I realized that I was no longer afraid. When Grandma was in her college years, she looked so much like me that it sometimes scared me. We were like two reflections in a mirror, only slightly less vivid. The same dark hair color, the same sincere but slightly mysterious smiles, even the tilt of her head when she was deep in thought was the same. I often looked at her and felt as though she carried some kind of secret within her that I needed to decipher. There was always something hidden in her gaze, like the fog at dawn. And I, as her reflection, tried to understand what she was trying to tell me, but I couldn't fully grasp her world. One day, while sitting in her house, flipping through old photographs, I came across one where she was young, with the same dark hair and the same mysterious expression on her face. "Grandma, look what I found," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. I caught her gaze, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow of memories flicker in her eyes. She approached me, and I noticed how her gaze became more focused, as if she froze for a second, staring at the picture. She silently walked over to the table and, as if not noticing me, began flipping through old folders on her laptop. I sat beside her, unable to look away. My heart was racing, as if I stood on the brink of uncovering a secret she had kept for so long. "We need to contact her," I blurted out before I could stop myself. I felt everything inside me flip at that thought, at the inevitability that hung over everything I had ever known. Now that I live with you, Dad can't stop her from seeing me anymore. She doesn't need to be afraid of him. We could. Grandma interrupted me. Her voice was soft, but there was an undertone I couldn't understand. It wasn't something simple, not just care or guidance. There was a worry in her tone that made me freeze. "Elsie," she said softly, and in that moment, I felt something heavy drop into my chest, as if I had suddenly come face to face with something I hadn't even suspected. I looked at her, unable to say a word. Her brief, loaded phrase echoing in my mind. You need to know something. Grandma stood up and walked to the table, opening her laptop. I clenched my hands, feeling an unpleasant sense of unease stir in my stomach. She began scrolling through files, and at some point, finding what she was looking for, she stopped. I stood next to her, like I was frozen, watching her actions, but it was hard for me to understand what exactly she was searching for. My heart tightened. What I saw in her eyes told me this was something important. Grandma took a deep breath, and in that moment, I knew she was hiding something. I could feel her words had been waiting to come out for a long time, but she didn't know how to say them. And finally, she said what she should have said long ago. I should have told you this earlier, but I was trying to protect you. Protect you from what your grandmother took away. I felt those words sink into my body like a cold stream of water that couldn't be stopped. She opened the file on the screen and began reading. Words I had never seen before appeared on the screen. My gaze was fixed on those lines, and I couldn't look away, feeling my fingers begin to freeze. She continued, each word plunging me deeper into an unknown, hidden part of the past. The day after your mother left, I wrote to her by email. The words were an invisible veil that she was lifting, and every word, every sentence deepened the chasm between what I knew and what I was about to discover. My hands turned icy, and I could hardly breathe. At the funeral, there were many people. Grandma Helen had been a true pillar of society, and her passing was a heavy blow to all who knew her. People came from all corners of the city to pay their respects: business partners, members of charitable boards, acquaintances from her numerous social clubs, distant relatives whose names I could barely recall. They all came to say goodbye to the woman who had been an anchor for so many, but whose presence only seemed indispensable after her departure. However, among all those faces, among those who made deep, sympathetic gestures and squeezed my hand with compassion, 3 people were conspicuously absent: my mother, my father, and Maria. Their absence didn't surprise me, but it felt particularly sharp, like another confirmation of how they had cut themselves out of our lives. They weren't there, and the empty space they left was filled with something heavy, almost tangible, that pressed down on my chest. I hadn't expected them to be there at that moment, but for some reason, it still hurt deeply. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Grandma's lawyer, Mr. Patterson. He asked me to come to his office to read her will. I didn't know what to expect from this visit, but at some point, I realized that perhaps I would learn something important about her life and the decisions she had made before her death. When I arrived, there was someone already in the notary's office, someone I hadn't seen in over 10 years. It was my mother. I froze at the door, unable to take a single step. She sat there in an expensive suit, which, despite its apparent value, didn't suit her at all. It was too large, ill-fitting, as if hastily purchased without regard for her true style and preferences. My mother barely glanced at me, and it made my heart tighten. I noticed how she kept glancing at her watch, as if all of this were just a formality to get through, something to endure rather than experience. But in her gaze, in her body, how she sat, how she kept her eyes fixed on her watch, there was such an aloofness that I felt like an entire chasm had opened between us, one we had both been building for decades. Mr. Patterson, sitting at the table with documents, looked a little awkward, as if unsure how to behave in such a situation. I saw him glance at both of us, trying to gauge the atmosphere that had suddenly filled the room, and finally, he spoke. "Elsie," he said, addressing me, "you probably know that Helen left behind several important instructions. I hope you're prepared for what you're about to hear." I nodded, though inside me there was only emptiness. My mother reacted only with a slight touch to her ear, as if trying to conceal her irritation, or perhaps her anxiety. I couldn't understand what she was feeling. Everything about her behavior suggested that, for her, this moment was just another necessary formality, something that had nothing to do with her true feelings. Mr. Patterson opened one of the envelopes and began reading the will. He read aloud the parts concerning the property, the money, and I had a strange feeling that he was paying too much attention to my mother, almost as if he were checking her reaction to each word. Grandma had left me the house, part of her savings, and a few personal items, including the old books I loved reading as a child. I felt a faint warmth in my chest. While I didn't believe that money or property could change my life, what Grandma had left me meant something much deeper. It was her love, her memory of how she took care of me, how she taught me to be strong. But to my surprise, at the end of reading the will, Mr. Patterson paused and looked at my mother. "And," he continued, "according to the latest instructions, Helen left you, miss." He hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right word. "You, Allison, a certain amount." He glanced at my mother, and I noticed how she stiffened. "However, by her will, the amount will be transferred only after one important condition is fulfilled." I stepped into the room and stopped for a moment to catch my breath. My mother sat in the chair, in that expensive suit, which clearly hadn't been bought from the best stores, but it still emphasized her attempt to look wealthier than she actually was. The man sitting next to her looked as though he'd been invited just for support. He was too young to be her partner, but old enough to create the impression that he held some place in her life. When I entered, she barely looked up. Her eyes were distant, as always. There was no regret, no apology, just cold indifference, something I knew all too well. I felt nothing but emptiness and regret for being there. "I'm your mother, Elsie," she finally said, her voice calm, but tinged with some kind of hurt. "You can't just throw me out onto the street." Her words hit my heart like blows, but I could no longer react to them. I couldn't just close my eyes and forgive. I looked at her and felt my patience begin to wear thin. This was no longer the hurt child, it was something much darker and more painful. "I gave birth to you, and then you abandoned me." Those words burned like fire. I had always tried to be a good daughter, but as soon as I began to understand what was really happening, she simply disappeared from my life. Left me with a father who, as you knew, was toxic and destructive for me. I felt my voice grow sharp and cold. "You never called, never wrote, never checked if I was okay," I said, and my words echoed in the silence like a blow to glass. She paled, and I noticed how her face twisted slightly as she tried to find an excuse, but quickly corrected herself. "You don't understand how complicated adult relationships are," she began to justify herself. But I could no longer listen to her. All these excuses, these attempts to shift the blame onto someone else, I couldn't tolerate it. So many years I had been without her. "If you turn your back on me now, you'll see I'll take care of everything." Her words were full of threats, but they no longer scared me. "Do you know how cruel and heartless a daughter you are?" Her voice became sharp, like the blade of a knife, and she continued, "I'll tell them how you left your own mother homeless." I sat there, watching her face, and at that moment, I understood that she had never changed. She still didn't realize that I was no longer the little girl she could manipulate into giving up. I was tired of her accusations, her victimhood, of her constant belief that the world should revolve around her pain. Without saying a word, I stood up, walked over to my desk, grabbed my laptop, and returned to her. My gaze was firm, and I opened the saved letter Grandma had kept all this time. It was a letter she had received from my mother many years ago. The words in it were full of anger and misunderstanding, full of things she had hidden from all of us. I pressed a key and began reading aloud. "I don't want her. I never loved her." I read these lines, and each word seemed to resonate in the air, as if the memory of a long past time had come alive. "Now she's Robert's problem. Forward this to all those high society friends you're so worried about." I spoke these lines, and the words seemed to consume the space between us. My mother, who had considered herself the victim all this time, now stood before me like a helpless creature trying to find an excuse for everything she had done. But this letter was her true face, the one she had tried to hide from all of us, the one buried beneath her layer of lies. Grandma had kept it all this time, like an amulet, a testament to who my mother really was. At that moment, I understood that for her, I was just another figure in her path, some symbol she could use to cover her own failures. But now it was all exposed.